Well, yes, it is early. It's almost 4 a.m. in the morning, but we're always ahead of the rest of the world in New Zealand, so it's quite normal. Usually at this time, I'm getting up to go and get an aeroplane somewhere, but if I turned up at the airport, none there, so I can't go anywhere. So it's better to be here sharing this with all of you people. And I'm heartened in the last couple of days to hear a number of world leaders, both present and former, coming out in support of the type of policies that we're advocating. I read a report from President Ortega of Nicaragua, former Mikhail Gorbachev, not former, but Mikhail Gorbachev, and there's other leaders who are putting their efforts behind the question of disinvestment and abolition of nuclear weapons. I'm going to rely on Alan Ware, who's there somewhere, to bring up, and I'll just give the slide number. Afterwards, you'll be able to get this. I presume that you can either get in touch with me or we'll put it up on the screen somewhere, this particular set of slides. And I'm grateful to Jeff for going through the type of actions, because those, I think, are common forms of action that people across every country can start taking action on in terms of disinvestment, both in terms of nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction in general, and of course on the issues of climate change. The position of Minister of Disarmament and Arms Control, and we can go to two, Alan, is, I think, unique in the world. As the Minister of Disarmament and Arms Control for New Zealand, I was actually quite lonely on the international stage. I never met another Minister of Disarmament and Arms Control. And in fact, in most of the powerful countries, they raised their eyebrows quite considerably that there was such a position. But one advantage it had was that I outranked most of the others who were at meetings, because they were usually an ambassador level. And because of such a snobbish outfit on the international stage, as a minister, I got prime billing. So I could usually give lectures, not that they took much notice, to the United States, to the United Kingdom, to France, all the nuclear powers. So it was quite satisfying personally. But more importantly, it was a signal to people in many countries that governments can take seriously the issue of ending nuclear weapons and in general movements to peace. And if you see those badges on the side, those are actually representing the strength of civil society in New Zealand, which brought about a government, a reforming government of '84. It was a Labour government at the time, which brought in this position and also brought in the legislation that made New Zealand a nuclear weapon-free country. And number three slide gives you the year on the left-hand side there, some years ago now, 1987, when the legislation was put in place that made it clear that New Zealand was, in the law, New Zealand was nuclear weapon free. We were in a nuclear weapon alliance before that and were seen as a reliable ally. We were touted as that. But we got kicked out of that alliance. It was called ANZUS, Australia-New Zealand Alliance. And we got kicked out of it because we became nuclear weapon free. But the very important point was that this had the massive support of the people, overwhelming support. And although there was a Conservative Party that had fought against this, gradually they had to adopt it too, because every time they went to an election, they got hammered on this issue, even from their own supporters. So there isn't a party in New Zealand now that would dare to go back to the position of allowing nuclear weapons in New Zealand, either in transit or to be stationed here. So that is perhaps just an example of our country where this strong position was brought about because of the support of the population. If you see on the right-hand side there, a little boat, a symbol that was ordinary people going out. We're surrounded by water. There are now 2 islands. and the peace squadron there went out onto the water, and thousands of boats of New Zealanders, and you'll see them sailing past actually a United States nuclear-powered submarine, and showing that they were in opposition to nuclear weapons being in New Zealand. So to number 4, what does the minister do? Well, first of all, the minister, she or he, has a statutory committee called the Public Advisory Committee on Disarmament and Arms Control. And that's has people from civil society who are on this committee. They give the minister advice on disarmament and arms control issues. Actually, the first advice I got was what all the acronyms meant, because there's just so many in this field. But they keep a very close eye on what is happening throughout the world. They're invaluable, actually, and they make a good link between government and civil society. PACDAC, which it's called, publishes its own reports, which are influential, drawing on international information on the question of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. And it's also a coordinator for the different groups, peace groups, whether they're religious or any other type of peace a group. Well, there's so many in New Zealand. It's actually a very, very useful committee to have for a minister. But New Zealand now has an advantage, therefore, of these issues being able to go through to a minister who's in the government. And when the government meets every Monday morning in the cabinet, myself as a minister, or the minister who's got that position, is there to advocate directly for these issues. And it therefore means there can be contestable advice. For example, the Minister of Foreign Affairs might sometimes be a little bit nervous about certain actions that you're taking, what effect it might have on the world stage. But the Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control can push strongly for the position. Number 5, the Minister has a key job of making sure that we don't in any way weaken our nuclear weapons-free status. This goes to the question also of nuclear power, because that is one of the questions that comes up from different time. Well, why don't we just have nuclear power stations as well to solve the environmental issues, particularly as a favorite one. Nuclear power would be good for the country, and it's not dangerous. That one's not used so much now, but after so many accidents. But it still means that the minister and the government have to be on alert to make sure there's no weakening of our position. And promoting steps for a nuclear-free world, that of course is one of the harder ones, and I know that from personal experience. I once spoke at a conference in Geneva on disarmament, which to my chagrin seemed to be actually for armament. Most of the representatives who came bought their briefcases, opened them, took out their lunch, and they went home again. And I suggested that it would be a very good idea for those countries that still had nuclear weapons to remember that the whole of the Southern Hemisphere was nuclear free. No weapons at all, nuclear weapon free zones across the whole Southern Hemisphere. I've been watching some Westerns and John Wayne Westerns, and I was impressed when people came into a Wild West town, they had to take off their guns and give it over to the sheriff. So I suggested to the nuclear powers that when they came into the Southern Hemisphere, that they checked all their nuclear weapons in at the equator, and they could get them on the way back. That wasn't met with universal approval, but it's the sort of promotion of a nuclear-free world. The nuclear weapon-free zones would have been very, very important for New Zealand as a member one in the South Pacific under the Treaty of Rarotonga, to also promote across the world. And it's been very heartening to see how many nuclear weapon-free zones have been established across the world, in fact, across the great percentage of the planet, I think. And the position of the minister and the legislation in which she or he works under is the South Pacific nuclear-free zone, which covers New Zealand, Australia, and the South Pacific, as it says. Number 6, Next one, Ellen. The New Zealand Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Act of 1987. There should be another slide coming up there. Anyway, I'll tell you what it is. The Nuclear Weapons Free Zone Act gives us the legal basis of making it illegal to have nuclear weapons in New Zealand. But perhaps more importantly, because that's a given now, you can't have any nuclear weapons, can't bring ships in or planes or any other way of deploying a nuclear weapon in New Zealand. But also, nobody, this next part of the Act, it prohibits agents of the Crown from supporting the manufacture of nuclear weapons anywhere in the world, implicitly prohibiting investment by government or public bodies in nuclear weapon corporations. And I'll come back to that because there's some legal issues in terms of how we can enforce investment outside of the New Zealand jurisdiction, but still it is clearly part of the intention of our legislation not to be involved in any way in the development of nuclear weapons. The Act itself, in the bottom part of the slide there, states no person who is a New Zealand citizen or a person ordinarily resident in New Zealand shall within the New Zealand nuclear free zone aid, abet, or procure any person to manufacture, acquire, possess, or have control over any nuclear explosive device. Those of you who are lawyers or if you come in contact with the criminal justice system will see that the wording is very much in line with what wording and prohibition of crimes, of acts, criminal acts. So it's actually a very, very strong piece of legislation. Not much notice was taken of it for quite some time. If we go to the next slide, I'll explain my point there. It was just taken that you didn't manufacture weapons in New Zealand. There was no arms industry. We didn't have lobbyists on the scale that they have in other countries for developing an arms. We don't even manufacture small arms, semi-automatic or automatic weapons. So there's no arms industry to speak of in New Zealand. And then further legislation was on the books as part of this whole push by setting up a Minister of Disarmament and Arms Control, of having New Zealand in the forefront of international legislation against weapons of mass destruction. So two other key parts of legislation were the Anti-Personnel Mines Prohibition Act of 1998, which the New Zealand public just supported wholesale, and the Cluster Munitions Prohibition Act of 2009. So alongside the legislation banning nuclear weapons, these other two acts, not just the conventions upon which they're based, but law in New Zealand, made it clear that anything to do with New Zealand was illegal. Now, if we turn to the focus of the legislation. So originally, it was just to prohibit nuclear weapons coming into New Zealand. But the public investment started to come under scrutiny, particularly with the 1996 International Court opinion, which made it clear that nuclear weapons globally are illegal, or gave impetus to that. And inside New Zealand, there was campaigning by parliamentarians, PNND, I think most of you know it stands for the Parliamentary Network of Nuclear Disarmament, members of our parliament, and many members are members of that, of the organizations of civil society, had the government adopt policies just to end investment of public funds anywhere. We didn't have the industry in New Zealand, but of the different public funds to put it into manufacturing weapons of mass destruction or any armaments or weapons. And it actually was a little bit of a surprise, I think, to New Zealanders, because they weren't focused on the international arms industry. I mean, people were aware of its power and its size and the profitability, but it was just assumed that perhaps New Zealand wasn't doing this. And the campaigning of civil society, the type of action that Jeff outlined before and others have spoken about, brought about a very strong public opinion and an obligation on the government to start taking action. And if I move to the next slide, okay, it's climate change too has come into this focus. That although it's not the same legislation in the same strong way that we have at prohibiting nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, but as with the rest of the world, this issue now has gripped the country, particularly the youngest generation, and there's demand that there be ethical investment and that any public funds in particular aren't used for action for industries that are harming the climate and the environment, the fossil fuel industry, and anything that's contrary to the different international accords, such as the Paris Agreement. And the government organizations, public, which I'll come to, of course, strong on this, but the private sector overall has been coming under increased pressure to emulate what the government is doing. And there's pressure building up for legislation. The first public entity I'll just point to is the Kiwi Bank. It's important because it's our only publicly owned national bank. There are other cooperative types of bank, but this is a public bank. I'm quite keen on this because it was the initiative of my party to put back into the hands of New Zealanders a bank that was under public control, and all our other banks are privately owned and actually foreign owned. So the Kiwi Bank's been able to take a lead. It has a policy which I put up there where it doesn't invest where there's abuse of the environment, where there are human rights abuses, and endemic illegal activities. And on their website, you can go to it, it says this covers weapons such as cluster bombs, landmines, depleted uranium, chemical and biological weapons. We exclude any company identified as being involved in this category. Now, it's international, so it doesn't have, no one's taken an organization to court yet, but the large companies and financial institutions are concerned that that's sort of around the corner. It's being discussed as to make it stronger and stronger to invest anywhere in the world, not just for the publicly owned, but for the privately owned. But this puts pressure. The Accident Compensation Corporation is also another important public body. This covers the whole of the country. If any of you visit New Zealand once these restrictions are lifted, I hope you do come, you are covered automatically. You don't have to sue anybody. If you have an accident, all your medical expenses are covered, and there's other compensation. And it's a very big fund. So what it does, it has clout. So the legislation requires that it must, when they put any investments, got to have a statement relating to ethical investment to avoid prejudicing New Zealand's reputation as a responsible member of the world community. Now you can see that's actually quite powerful because it's nuclear weapons, it's weapons of mass destruction, it affects climate change, but human rights abuses, a whole range of the international covenants to which New Zealand belongs, and explicitly ban nuclear explosive devices. You can't invest in them. And that gives us quite a power in terms of disinvestment. The New Zealand Superannuation Fund is 100% publicly owned, set up under the Parliament. It also has a responsible investment framework and banned what you can see there: cluster munitions, nuclear explosive devices, anti-personnel mines, civil automatic and semi-automatic firearms. And there's guidelines for ethical investment on the change and the environment. Now, these are all publicly owned funds, so pressure can come on through legislation, through the government. I mean, they appoint the directors, so they can sack them if they do anything which is against any of that. But because of the competition, the private investment companies and different banks, they're also having pressure. What Jeff pointed to, people can remove. They can put up shareholder resolutions. They can take their funds out of it. And many people are moving from a fund where they say, we're not satisfied with your investment policy. It's not ethical. We are moving to KiwiSaver or one of the other funds which make it clear that we are not going to invest in nuclear weapons. We're not going to invest in destructive practices for the environment, and we're not going to invest in anything which smacks of human rights abuses. So the pressure is on because of what is done in the public sector, and because the public can be coming behind that and using their dollar power and their influence in their institutions and their organization and on the political parties, they can put the pressure in this way. Lastly, the investment performance. Of course, there's even the best intended people, if they're going to lose some money, they think, oh, perhaps I just better leave this, and it's not really doing much harm. That may be what they think. But one powerful way to help persuade people across that ethical line is to point out that Norway, which influenced us very much when it began its disinvestment in 2005, it hasn't been harmed. In fact, its performance of the Norwegian pension fund apparently has gone up. And similarly in New Zealand, there have been excellent results from the disinvestment, and the link there to the ACC, they show that their performance has been extremely good. Well, that's me, and I look forward to hearing the next presentations and then having the break and getting a coffee before the sun comes up. Thank you.